As Francis Schaeffer wisely noted, if you want to understand individuals and civilizations, you must understand how they think and what they believe, because what people believe determines how they act. While simple, this is also a profound summary of why individuals and civilizations do the things they do. People act on the basis of what they truly think, believe, and imagine about reality. People get into cars or airplanes because they truly imagine getting to their desired destinations. They don't really imagine accidents or crashes, or they would stay home. People lie, steal, and murder because they imagine positive results, not getting caught and punished. The Bible refers to this as the deceitfulness of sin. We are tempted to do evil because we are deceived into imagining it to be a no-cost, no-risk shortcut to some imagined positive outcome. Those who seek wisdom realize that fixed moral boundaries and an awareness of the potential costs and risks are valuable counterweights to appealing fantasy-based shortcuts. Those who appear to get away with evil encourage other fools to do the same. But we all make decisions daily on the basis of what we imagine about reality. Wisdom, or understanding and good judgment about life and civilization, can be gained in two ways. The first is the most painful method, for these are the lessons we learn the hard way, experiencing the costly results of our own mistakes and bad judgment. On the other hand, the easier method is to learn from the successes and mistakes others have already made, so that we can avoid bad ideas and ways of doing things that do not work. History is filled with examples of where philosophies, ideologies, and methods are successful, as well as the failures. This is one of the greatest benefits available in studying history, but it is of no value when people forget the past and/or have no interest in learning those kind of lessons. History reveals that those who skip class when the lessons of history are discussed will tend to get lower grades in the school of reality. These folks often repeat the mistakes of the past because they arrogantly thought themselves more advanced than those before them and forge ahead, unaware that the ideas they believe to be new and better have already been tried and failed in the past. These principles can apply to civilizations as well as individuals. During the last 300 years, Western civilization has been undergoing the process of rejecting the distorted supernaturalism of Europe prior to 1700 in favor of materialistic atheism, which has changed how we think about origins and the past. In cosmology, Earth history, life's origin and diversity, human origins, and human history. This same process has already played out in Greco-Roman history beginning 2,600 years ago. To understand the present, we can gain some perspective from looking at the flow of ideas over the centuries, for the same patterns are being repeated. From the earliest records of human activity down to around 600 BC, there was an almost universal belief in the reality of the supernatural realm, with one or more deities involved with the natural order and influencing human life. As people groups moved away from Mesopotamia after the language division, they took their family of gods with them, with each now being given a different name in each language group. The gods and goddesses of Mesopotamia arrived in Greece around 800 BC, and Homer gave them Greek names and placed them on top of Mount Olympus. However, regardless of the names and location, these deities were just imagined bigger versions of sinful people, dishonest, sexually immoral, and trying to outmaneuver each other. No wonder they were rejected. In the 6th century BC, a few Greek philosophers rejected the gods on Mount Olympus and the supernatural in general. But you still have to explain reality somehow, so if the supernatural's excluded, then all that is left is matter and natural processes. Accordingly, Anaximander and Empedocles turned to philosophy, in their quest to explain life without the supernatural. They assumed and developed a new story rooted in materialism, the belief that physical matter is all there is, and naturalism, that natural processes alone shape matter into all of its forms, including life.
We assume that matter itself is already alive, that nature makes experiments, and that the successful forms survive and thrive.
Life forms began in the sea, and new forms developed as they overcame obstacles and adapted to new environments. Eventually, one form crawled out onto land, survived and remained, and then new forms appeared by the same processes. Accordingly, humans must have arisen from some earlier animal form.
If this sounds familiar, it should, because this scenario reappeared 160 years ago as Darwinism.
The speculations of Anaximander and Empedocles provided an origin story for those who wanted an alternative to the supernatural, but we rejected as unlikely because it depends too heavily on chance events.
We believe it much more likely that there is an intelligence behind the form and order of the observable universe.
From my observations and rational investigation, I have concluded that a perfect creator would have produced all variations of life forms at the beginning. Being perfectly designed, they would all be present from the beginning and would not change over time. They can be arranged with the simplest at the bottom and the most complex at the top. This is the great chain of being.
By simple observation, I have discerned that the Earth must sit motionless at the center of the universe. We observe all of the other heavenly lights and bodies orbiting around the Earth.
Well, these ideas may also sound familiar because they reappeared in medieval European culture 1,000 years ago. Rome had its own traditional gods, but as it expanded to control all the nations around the Mediterranean, it added statues of all the recognized deities of those conquered lands to the Pantheon, a building in Rome to honor all the gods. New religions, not recognized by the state, were forbidden in the belief that their appearance would insult the recognized deities and bring decline to the empire's welfare. Rome's army conquered the nation of Greece in 146 BC, but Roman culture would soon fall to Greek philosophy as educated slaves were imported to teach the children of Rome's upper classes. Rome's future leaders learned about Plato and Aristotle, but also the materialism and naturalism of Anaximander and Empedocles. Eventually, Rome's upper classes rejected the gods of Rome for what was portrayed as enlightened atheism. The successful spread of Roman civilization also led to the historically predictable rejection of the old values that had given Rome its strength. Roman culture was beginning to unravel when Jesus appeared. And this is why Caesar Augustus made a concerted effort to restore the earlier values. Along with passing new laws, he asked the poet Virgil to write a mythological history of Rome to support his attempts to revive Roman civilization, which resulted in the Aeneid. Whether a collection of deified humans atop Mount Olympus or deified emperors sitting on a throne in Rome, sinful humanity make poor objects of worship. Christianity began to win followers among the common people as it offered the Bible's benevolent and faithful creator, with Jesus as the fulfillment of the Hebrew prophets, offering salvation to all nations. Amongst a people losing hope in any ultimate reality, the new faith quickly took root and began to spread throughout the empire. Rome persecuted Christianity from 65 to 313 AD, believing that Rome's decline was due to the gods of Rome being jealous and angry because this new religion was taking away their followers in local areas. After continuing to spread, even under persecution, the Emperor Constantine and his Eastern counterpart legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan and Constantine favored it with legislation in the hope that it could salvage a crumbling empire. By 381, attendance at the pagan temples was waning, and the philosophies of Anaximander and Empedocles were being forgotten. So Emperor Theodosius I closed the pagan temples, which made Christianity, in effect, the new state religion of Rome. This was the beginning of Christendom, the Christianized culture of Europe, and it was not as bad as the Enlightenment would later paint it. However, as it was transformed into a theocratic blending of church and state, Roman Christianity did swerve away from its biblical foundation. Pursuing Constantine's push for a theocracy, theologians gradually altered New Testament elements to resemble Old Testament and Jewish things. Ordained servants became a robed clergy. Church buildings were built with two sections like the Mosaic tabernacle and temple. Baptism of repentant believers was shifted to infant baptism and confirmation, modeled after infant circumcision and bar mitzvah. Unbelievers became Canaanites to forcibly convert or kill. God's promise that David's family would retain the throne over Israel became divine right monarchies throughout Europe, and so on. Since the city of Rome had been the center of the empire, the bishops of Rome increasingly claimed primacy for the church in Rome, which eventually culminated in the papacy. The authority of Scripture declined as some of its authority was given to popes and church traditions. As the Roman Empire declined, converted officials continued to serve in political functions, and gradually the Roman Church took on the organizational structure of the empire. There were local officials, priests, who operated under regional officials, archbishops, who functioned like governors and senators, with a Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Roman religion, over the whole thing in the papacy. Along with taxation, centuries of Christians dying and leaving wealth and property to the church gradually made it the major landowner in Europe, especially in France. In the 9th century, Christian scholars rediscovered the Greek philosophers, especially Plato and Aristotle, and began blending their ideas about nature with biblical teaching. Two of their ideas became central in medieval thinking. Plato's great chain of being taught that all life forms were present from the beginning, so there had been no biological change over time. Aristotle taught that the earth is fixed and unmoving at the center of the universe. When Scholasticism led to the revival of the universities, they were built on Plato and Aristotle. While their ideas were not taught in the Bible, they were blended into European Christian thinking. So the Enlightenment could later point to earth-centered cosmology and no biological change over time as Christian errors concerning nature, without remembering the true source of those ideas. Over the centuries, there were people who realized the Roman Church was swerving away from biblical teaching, and some of them, like Peter Waldo, John Wycliffe, Savonarola, and Huss, tried to do something about it, sometimes at the cost of their lives. By 1500, many secular rulers were growing tired of the taxes paid to Rome and were ready to support reformers like Zwingli, Luther, and Calvin against Rome. Rome sent out armies to suppress them, but nobles responded with their own armies, and the Reformation Wars continued until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Afterward, Europe was a bit of a mess, with bitter divisions between Catholic countries and the nations allied with various Reformation groups, who often did not get along very well with each other. Then you also had divine right monarchies in various nations that were disconnected from the common people, and did not get along very well with each other either. The situation was especially difficult in France, where the Roman Church and the French monarchy were closely linked. Since the Church was a major landowner that did not pay taxes, and the monarchy maintained a luxurious lifestyle at public expense, France was heading into financial difficulties. Intellectuals René Descartes and Baruch Spinoza planted seeds of changed thinking about God, nature, and reason that would soon take root in Paris. Descartes held that seekers of truth must assume a skeptical approach, especially towards the supernatural, and Spinoza advocated that God is nothing more than the forces of nature, and that only an educated elite is fit to determine what is and is not reasonable. Beginning around 1689, disgruntled intellectuals in Paris began meeting in the salons to discuss the problems which they attributed, ultimately, to Christianity and the Bible. This led to a movement that would later be called the Enlightenment, and it would play a large role in changing the course of Western civilization. Well, France was in trouble, and the French philosophers in Paris, who came to be known as Philosophers, rightly saw the politically powerful Roman Church and the self-absorbed divine right monarchy as at the heart of it. They concluded that the only route to a new and better Europe required diminishing and demolishing both of them. Rather than see biblical Christianity as something good which needed to be distinguished and rescued from its time-encrusted corruptions, as the Reformers had intended to do in other areas of Europe, the Philosophers saw the Bible and Christianity as the evil common element and cause of both. To bring down any building or institution, you only need to destroy the foundation, and what is built upon it will collapse. The Bible taught supernaturalism, creation, and a curse on nature, and revealed information from God. So they targeted these ideas for ridicule, and in their place embraced an opposite philosophical worldview. For them, reality was limited to physical matter and natural processes, which they optimistically assumed had an inherent tendency to evolve towards higher levels of order, from early simple and primitive forms to later complex and advanced forms. And finally, they asserted that human reason is the only source of knowledge and understanding. These three propositions denied the reality of the supernatural realm, the curse of decay upon nature, and revealed information from outside the natural realm, or inspired scripture. Upon this base, new stories would be developed to contradict every major element of the biblical story with plausible-sounding alternative explanations.
God is eternal. Matter is eternal. The universe had a beginning. The universe has always existed. The earth is young. The earth is old. Life comes from life. Life arose from non-life. Life began in major kinds. Protozoa evolved into all life. Man created separately. Man evolved from animals. Miracles are possible. Miracles are impossible. Catastrophic flood. No flood. Uniformitarianism. Jesus is the Messiah, God. Jesus never lived, or was just a man. Jesus will return and there will be a final judgment. There will be no second coming or judgment.
While outright atheism was a big step for a Europe that had for centuries been based on Christianity, deism was a good halfway house on the road to dismissing God, for it asserted that he existed and had created, but then abandoned the universe to its own natural processes. If all God did was create and then abandon us, it was a small step to eventually dismiss God altogether, even as creator. With the supernatural and immaterial dismissed from reality, All that is left is matter and natural processes. They reason that for natural processes alone to have organized inanimate matter into all of its later forms, including life, there must be an inherent tendency within nature towards upward self-organization, development, and progress. Imagining biblical notions of God, creation, and curse to have stalled the inherent progress tendency in nature and human history, they imagine that with these eliminated, the natural order and European civilization would resume its inherent tendency towards progress, freedom, and would produce a paradise on earth. A century of French intellectuals preaching atheism and anarchy produced a predictable result. The financial problems were growing, and a harsh winter and crop failure in 1789 led France to the breaking point. The mob in Paris stormed the Bastille, a fortress where political prisoners had been confined. They arrested the king and queen and beheaded them, and began rounding up nobles to bring to Paris for public executions. Catholic churches were closed and turned into temples of reason, while clergy were hunted down and killed. The philosophers argued over various new forms of government, but had no common foundation for morality or public order, so they eventually were fighting with each other, and even some of them were sent to the guillotines. After a decade of increasing turmoil, a popular military officer, Napoleon Bonaparte, took over to restore order. He put education back in the hands of the Catholic Church because the progressives had made a mess of that too. Then he decided that France needed a new goal, so the conquest of Europe was given top priority, and that occupied the next 15 years. Napoleon failed to conquer European territory with the sword, but the French philosophers would successfully conquer Europe's mind and heart with the Enlightenment worldview, which was already spreading to intellectuals in other countries. Once the foundational philosophical assumptions of materialism, naturalism, inherent evolutionary progress or development, and reliance upon human reason were in place, men in several countries contributed to the production of new stories, by which to explain specific areas of nature and the past, with God no longer involved. Immanuel Kant and Simon Laplace produced the nebular hypothesis, which asserted that the solar system evolved from a hot gas cloud, cooling into the sun, and orbiting bodies that cooled into solid planets, eventually producing water and life. James Hutton and Charles Lyell built upon the early molten earth idea and removed the Great Flood by asserting that no major catastrophic events were necessary to explain Earth history. Normal, uniform, non-catastrophic processes of sedimentation, weathering, and erosion operating over deep time could account for every feature on the Earth's surface. Building on Lyell's assertion of uniform processes operating over long periods of time, Charles Darwin produced a similar story to explain how all life had evolved from an original single-celled life form, protozoa. After publishing The Origin of Species by means of natural selection in 1859, the idea that humans had slowly evolved from an ape-like ancestor by the same processes was presented in 1863 in books published by T.H. Huxley and Charles Lyell. Darwin published his version of that story, The Descent of Man, in 1871. That same year, Darwin was asked about life's origin and responded that it was probably something like a fortuitous mixture of chemicals in a warm little pond somewhere. His zealous supporter in Germany, Ernst Haeckel, claimed that the simplest life had no organs, but were simply membranes filled with protoplasm, and that all life forms repeat their evolutionary history during their embryonic development. George Hegel asserted that the history of civilization could be understood in terms of the rise and fall of successive levels of villages, city-states, and then empires, as the Geist, the divine spirit, evolves within them, wearing one out and moving on to the next, gradually causing each new civilization to rise a little higher than the previous one. The final and highest form of human civilization, according to Hegel, was the German national state of the 1800s. Karl Marx later offered his view that civilization had developed by dialectical materialism, an economic class struggle, with a thesis being countered by an antithesis, and this conflict led to a new and better synthesis. A number of German Bible critics, assuming the Enlightenment scenario, produced an evolutionary progress explanation for Israel's history, the origins of Christianity, and the formation of the Bible that goes something like this. The Old Testament story portraying the Jews as God's special people was produced in Babylon in the 5th century BC by unknown Jewish scribes blending together Jewish legends and Mesopotamian prehistory myths. Thus, the supernatural and historical accounts from Genesis through the book of Acts are largely fiction and cannot be taken seriously. A similar mythology was created around Jesus, who either never existed or was just a normal man later deified and embellished with miracles by the church. The Gospels and New Testament books were, also, written long after the events by unknown editors. The Catholic Church controlled Europe by force through the Inquisition, assaulted peaceful Islam in the Middle East by means of the Crusades, and burned millions of witches. Christianity has continually stood in the way of human freedom, progress, and science. Well, these new stories were promoted under the respected labels of reason and science, and were the kind of stories that secular intellectuals wanted to believe, and they have used them to convey the impression within Western civilization that reason and science have demolished all credibility for God and the Bible. As these ideas quickly attained orthodoxy and dogma status in the universities, governments, and media, Christianity was increasingly suppressed and misrepresented, so that more and more people think they have no choice but to turn away from it. Enlightenment, materialism, naturalism, and inherent progress moved through Marx to Lenin, and then swept across Russia and into China and North Korea, producing what came to be oppressive state socialism and communism. This cultural transformation was promoted under the false labels of liberation, progress, and creating a workers' paradise. The Enlightenment version of history portrays the period when Christianity dominated Europe as the Dark Ages, an era of ignorance, superstition, and intellectual tyranny. People were forced to believe church dogmas and were not allowed to question the reigning orthodoxy, or they would be ridiculed and punished as a heretic, an enemy of God and truth. Clergy who questioned orthodoxy were removed, and some of this happened. On the other hand, the Enlightenment has portrayed itself as a new era of reason and science, committed to freedom of open inquiry, where dissenters can question all ideas without fear of ridicule or persecution, and tolerance towards all opinions. But is that really how it operates? Increasingly, we see that the Enlightenment actually fostered what has become an era of political and scientific correctness, where all are pressured to believe secular dogmas, especially materialism and naturalism. People are not allowed to question that orthodoxy. Dissenters outside of academia, even those with college degrees, are ridiculed as ignorant anti-science religious fundamentalists, enemies of reason, evidence, and truth. Well-credentialed academics, even in the sciences, who express doubt, are removed from faculty positions. In France, dissenters were sent to the guillotines. In communist Russia, China, and North Korea, dissenters have been sent away to work camps, psychiatric hospitals, re-education centers, or killed. In the early 1960s, the U.S. Supreme Court began handing down rulings that prayer and the Bible must be kept separate from the public sector, education, and government, removing the Ten Commandments and declaring that evolution is science while creation and intelligent design were religious doctrines that could not be considered in public schools. Christianity has increasingly been portrayed in terms of ignorance, hatred, racism, and even terrorism. The major news media overemphasize or even create false issues to attack those they hate, while ignoring details and even refusing to report the crimes of those they support. The cancel culture now ruthlessly silences all who oppose it, often without providing any defense or justification, simply declaring any idea or comment they do not like to be racist or hate speech. People suddenly lose social media accounts and even their jobs for a simple comment, sometimes made many years ago. In any civilization, if you want to know who is really in control and what the prevailing orthodoxy is, just identify who or what you are not allowed to criticize. Speak against that, and the marginalization, ridicule, and punishment will soon follow. We have looked at the flow of big ideas that have changed Western civilization over the last 3,000 years. In doing so, we have seen Western thinking zigzag from Greek philosophy to early Christianity, medieval theology, and then back to Greek philosophy. For those who wish to be honest and open-minded truth seekers, it will be necessary to recognize and reject the orthodoxy mindset and resist the cultural pressure that it brings with it. Keep in mind that orthodoxy and heresy, or what is culturally promoted as correct and wrong opinion, are determined by those in control of society at any given time, but it may not necessarily reflect reality. Popular ideas are not always true, and unpopular ideas are not always false. Sometimes what is believed about reality may be based more on what those in power want to be true than what the evidence is really pointing to. In the same way, dogmas, ideas that those in control tell people that they have to believe, are not always accurate portrayals of biblical teaching or nature. So how do you identify orthodoxy and dogma? We have already noted Voltaire's version of this, but if you want to identify the current ideological orthodoxy and its dogmas, just recognize what ideas everyone is expected to believe and are not allowed to question, doubt, or reject without paying some cultural penalty. If you want orthodoxy, then just believe whatever those in charge, experts, teachers, government officials, tell you to believe. If you want truth, then look for reasons as to why you should believe or not believe this or that. What's the most likely explanation according to observations, evidence, and logical analysis of what's known so far? When people are told to believe certain things without evidence, then you're probably looking at dogma. When you hear someone say that you should believe something because all scientists and educated people believe it, look out, because rarely do all experts or educated people believe the same thing on any topic, and many who do may be just following the academic crowd. So, be on the lookout for assertions about nature, as well as the supernatural and the Bible, politics, economics, racism, etc., that you're just expected to believe because those with influence in society say so. Be open-minded enough that you want to understand reality and are open to considering different possibilities, while also being hesitant to believe something until you're given enough evidence and solid reasoning to be inwardly convinced that the idea is worth believing. And also, be on the lookout for ideas that you're supposed to believe for no other reason than to avoid the threat of cultural pressure and penalties. If you refuse to embrace certain ideas or words, Will others still respect your freedom to think for yourself? Or will they subject you to ridicule and social rejection? Will they call you ignorant, stupid, or anti-science if you don't go along? Will you be kicked off of social media or lose your job for doing nothing more than holding an opinion or just using a term that differs from what those in control have determined to be the current orthodoxy? If you have to threaten or punish people to get them to agree with you, then you're not promoting a convincing view of reality, but are just an intellectual or cultural thug. When bad ideas attain the status of dogma and orthodoxy, they tend to be very hard to correct or replace, even as problems accumulate, because those who promote and protect them have so much of their own egos and cultural status invested in them. Thus, people loyal to current orthodoxy tend to respond emotionally when anyone disagrees with established ideas, either angry that anyone would dare question those ideas, and or afraid of the possibility that current orthodoxy might be wrong, and then they might need to reconsider the whole thing and have to change their beliefs. For non-thinkers who want to believe what others tell them to believe, the prospect of having to rethink large topics on their own can be terrifying. If popular ideas are valid, they will survive reevaluation of accumulating evidence and even be stronger afterwards. However, if they do not survive continuing scrutiny, then you're further along in the search for truth. In the next video, we will investigate how the Enlightenment corrupted science to promote its own cultural and philosophical agenda.